This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will return. Acts chapter 1, verse 11. I hadn't seen my old headmaster for, well, let us just say for many, many years. I remember him so clearly. A wonderful character, a giant of a man, with thick black curly hair, sparkling eyes. He so often would talk about his Italian grandmother. And he had a fund of stories from the war, for he fought across Europe. And he escaped capture by the advancing German army, rolled up in a carpet in the Vatican. But I mustn't digress. The point is, he had a great impact on me as a schoolboy at an impressionable age. He was full of fun, and he was a committed Christian. It was a few years ago now, by chance, my wife and I were driving through the Dorset town where he had retired, and on an impulse we dropped in to see him. It was a strange experience meeting him after all those years, and I will admit that I was a little bit nervous, perhaps almost shy, when I rang the doorbell. What would he be like? And I was surprised, quite shocked, by the lean old man who opened the door. He was no taller than me. His voice was now softer and gentler than I remember. The thick black hair had gone, but his eyes were the same, twinkling and smiling. Within minutes he was into one of his stories, punctuated by his skill and his amazing ability to imitate people. We talked and we talked and we reminisced and we laughed. Nothing had changed. He was just the same, thank God. He might have aged, well, of course he changed, but he was the same. And when I finally said goodbye to him, I made a point of saying, "You know, you haven't changed. You're just the same." Reading again this story of the Ascension, some words struck me forcibly, words which I find very reassuring. This same Jesus will return, Luke says. That is what the two men in white had actually said to the disciples, who were anxiously looking up into the sky, presumably anxious because they feared they might never see Jesus again. There can be little doubt from the gospel story that the risen Christ was different in appearance, in some intangible way, and I seem to detect a definite relief experienced by the disciples when they discover that he is really the same, even if for some reason they hadn't initially recognized him. We have two clear stories. Interestingly, both seem to centre on meals, where Jesus joins his disciples in his resurrected form. Firstly, on that first Easter evening, the meal at Emmaus, where you remember two of the disciples only recognized their mysterious companion when he sat down and blessed bread and broke it. And then secondly, when the 7 disciples were fishing on the lake, and Jesus invites them to join him for a barbecue of fish on the shore. And we read that when he invited them, none of them dared ask him who he was. St. John tells us they knew quite well it was the Lord, and yet there was a hint of uncertainty, which they felt awkward about. And this is strange when you think about it. The implication is that he was somehow different in appearance, but in the way he did things, or the way he invited them, or the way he prepared the fish, or gave thanks for the bread, something was overwhelmingly reminiscent of their beloved master. And Was it the way he talked to them and discussed things with them while they were enjoying a meal, I wonder? Was it that was so familiar? The Germans have a word which we don't have in English, Tischreden, which refers to the talking and communicating that goes on during a shared meal. Table chatter, I suppose, is a poor translation, but it's not about trivial things. Some scholars suggest that many of Jesus' parables are stories that he told his friends at mealtime. And there can be little doubt that Jesus was a great socializer, that he mixed with all sorts of company. Indeed, he was criticised for keeping bad company, eating with sinners, they said. Equally, we read that he was prepared to have a meal with his opponents, with the Pharisees. And of course, supremely, we think of him sharing the Last Supper with his disciples. That special occasion, that culmination of all his teaching, and clearly a very, very solemn meal. But on other occasions, I imagine there was light-hearted chatter, full of fun and laughter. Indeed, his opponents often criticised Jesus for being a glutton and a drunkard. I'm quite sure he was neither, but he would hardly have attracted this criticism if he were an ascetic and awkward Puritan, which is how he is sometimes portrayed. Nothing could be less true, I'm sure. No, there could be little doubt in my mind that Jesus was fun, that he was the life and soul of the party, that it was great to spend an evening with him. And no wonder the fiery-tempered Peter, the devoted and thoughtful John, and the fanatic Simon the Zealot all loved him and stayed with him and revelled in his company. And so I picture a question being asked during a meal, and perhaps Jesus would smile mischievously, and then he'd tell one of his incredible stories. His hearers would be left challenged by his wisdom, but they'd also be left having to draw out their own conclusions as to what he was teaching. What was the point of that story? A parable. And so at Emmaus, when Jesus broke bread with his disciples, they said to each other, "He hasn't changed." "He's not changed," said the 7, as they shared the barbecue on the lakeside with him. And so I turn to the Ascension-tide message of the two men in white. This same Jesus will return. Some versions of the Bible leave that out, but most keep it in. This same Jesus will return. I think the men in white were suggesting, your same beloved friend, he hasn't lost his compassion, his humour, his warmth, in spite of all he's been through in his ghastly ordeal and his terrible death. He's renewed, he's changed, he's resurrected. Supremely, he is still the same. And then what does Luke say? The disciples returned to Jerusalem with great joy. No wonder. I think, apart from anything else, they are reassured that Jesus has not ceased to be the Jesus they knew and they loved so much. Now this has enormous implications for you and me when you think about it. Firstly, of course, it tells us with confidence of the changelessness of Christ. And then secondly, it implies that neither we nor our loved ones will be just a ghost-like form or a memory in the afterlife, but a recognizable entity. St. Paul emphasized that we will be changed by our death. And of course we will be changed. We would want to be, wouldn't we? We wouldn't want to struggle on with an old and worn-out human body. But we still will be who we are, and we will be recognizable as such. I tell you frankly, I don't understand the ascension. Neither do I understand the resurrection. But I'm totally convinced that both happened, and that both are amazingly good news for you and me. So I leave you with my message for Ascension Tide. Firstly, we haven't lost the human Jesus, the character his disciples loved so much. God has a human face which we can in some measure relate to. Jesus, this same Jesus who promised that he would be with us always to the end of all time. And then secondly, those I love who have died are not lost. One day I will see them. I will recognize them. They will recognize me into all eternity. Thank God.